Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us quite a stack of sources, and honestly, they took us on a really fascinating journey into human choices, actions, and, well, what it even means to be in control of ourselves.
It's a huge topic, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, these sources touch on everything from the subtle biases that kind of nudge our everyday decisions,
Right.
all the way to the deep mechanics of self-control, the power we find in goals and plans, and even, well, the really complex and sometimes, frankly, paradoxical nature of self-defeating behavior.
Exactly. So, our mission in this deep dive for you is to guide you through this material, pull out the most important nuggets, I guess, and really help connect the dots on what drives us to do what we do, sometimes for the better and sometimes, well, maybe not so much.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back to this.
So diving right in, one of the first kind of fundamental points the sources make is about human behavior itself. It seems unlike most animal behavior, which is often, reactive or instinctual, ours seems deeply tied to meaning.
That's absolutely crucial. It's the starting point. Human actions aren't just simple responses to stimuli. They're guided by ideas, concepts, and what something actually means to us. And of course, that meaning is heavily shaped by the culture we're in. Our ability to think, our sort of inner world, that's what allows us to use that meaning to guide what we do and hopefully make better choices along the way.
So thinking lets us pause
Right.
and consider the meaning behind what we might do. And the sources highlighted something I found really interesting, just imagining ourselves doing something, whether it's like running a marathon or maybe just having a difficult conversation. That act of imagination seems to make the actual action more plausible, more likely to happen.
Yes, absolutely. Visualizing the process in action seems particularly powerful. It's like it prepares the ground, makes the path seem clearer in our minds. There are studies, for instance, showing students who imagine the process of studying effectively.
Not just the good grade at the end.
Exactly. Not just the outcome, but the how. Sitting down, opening the book, focusing. They actually end up spending more time studying compared to those who just fantasize about the A-plus goals, like a mental rehearsal.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so meaning and thinking, they're foundational. But, I mean, how do we actually navigate the huge number of possibilities out there and land on a specific choice? The sources talk about a typical two-step process we tend to follow.
Right. Step one is usually pretty fast. We quickly narrow down a whole range of potential choices to just a manageable few. Think about choosing a restaurant or even a major life decision like picking a career path. Your mind doesn't weigh every single option equally. It filters fast.
Which, as the sources point out, means we might quickly toss out a perfectly good option sometimes, but it's kind of a necessary shortcut, isn't it? Our brains just can't handle the sheer volume of choices modern life throws at us.
Precisely. It's adaptive. And then step two is where we take that smaller list, those sort of highlighted options, and compare them more carefully. This is where you might consciously weigh pros and cons. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, this comparison process. It isn't always purely rational. Not by a long shot. The sources point out several really powerful influences that subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, push and pull our decisions.
And these are key, I think, to understanding why we sometimes make choices that, looking back, maybe don't seem to be in our best long-term interest. One big one they mention is risk aversion.
Oh, definitely. We seem hardwired to give more weight to potential losses than potential gains.
Yeah.
The classic example, right? The simple coin flip. Win $10 if it's heads, lose 10 if it's tails. Statistically fair bet. But most people won't take it. Why? Because the pain of losing that $10 just feels stronger, more impactful than the pleasure of winning 10.
It looms larger.
It really does. Yeah. And research backs this up. When people do make irrational bets, it's often driven more by trying to avoid a guaranteed loss than by chasing a probable gain. That fear is a powerful motivator.
Okay, fear of loss. That's huge. Another massive factor, and this one seems to connect to so many other issues we'll likely touch on, is temporal discounting.
Yes. This is absolutely fundamental. We value the present far, far more heavily than the future.
We want it now.
We want it now. A sooner, maybe smaller reward often feels disproportionately more valuable than a larger reward we have to wait for. Think about lottery winners, right? Many choose the smaller lump sum today instead of much larger annual payments spread out over decades. Our immediate desires they shout louder than our future needs often do.
And it's fascinating how pervasive that is. The sources even mentioned research suggesting things like just seeing attractive people can temporarily increase this focus on immediate rewards.
It's true. It speaks to how deeply ingrained this present bias can be. It's not always a conscious calculation.
Wow, okay. And then there's the certainty effect.
Right. We tend to place this kind of undue weight, this premium, on things that are certain compared to things that are just probable or possible.
The Russian roulette example in the sources was pretty stark on this one. People are willing to pay significantly more money to remove the very last bullet from the gun.
Achieving absolute certainty.
Achieving that 100% certainty of safety compared to paying to remove one bullet when, say, several still remain, even if the statistical reduction in risk is exactly the same in both scenarios.
Yes, that drive for absolute certainty, even if getting it is disproportionately expensive or difficult, can really skew our decisions about risk reduction in the real world.
Yeah.
We might, overinvest in eliminating some tiny risk completely while neglecting a much larger, more probable risk simply because we can't reduce that one to absolute zero.
That makes sense. And finally, the sources mention a preference some people have for just keeping options open, like actively postponing decisions.
Yeah, even if it means losing out on opportunities down the line.
Yeah.
It's a bit counterintuitive sometimes.
How so?
Well, think about online shopping deals. Maybe you're offered a discount if you buy right now, versus waiting and potentially losing the deal. A surprising number of people choose to wait, effectively prioritizing keeping the option open, even if the likely outcome is they pay more later or don't buy at all.
Speaking of postponing, sometimes we just flat out decide not to decide, right? Decision avoidance.
Oh, absolutely. It's a real thing, and it ties into some of these biases we've just discussed. A major driver seems to be anticipated regret.
We're afraid we'll kick ourselves later.
Exactly. We avoid making a choice because we fear we'll regret the outcome. And interestingly, the research suggests people anticipate feeling less regret over something bad happening because they didn't act.
An omission.
An omission, right, compared to something bad happening because they took an action, even if the objective outcome is the same, or even worse, for doing nothing.
That fear of doing something wrong feels stronger than the fear of missing out by not doing something, which ties right into the status quo bias, doesn't it?
It does. We often prefer things to just stay as they are, because change feels inherently risky and the outcome is unknown. And closely related is the omission bias, or you could call it the power of the default option. We tend to just take the path that requires the least effort, the path of least resistance, which is usually just doing nothing, sticking with the default.
Yeah.
And sometimes, honestly, the problem is just too many choices. That famous study with the jam display.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Consumers shown a table with like 24 different varieties of jam were actually much less likely to buy any jam at all compared to those who were shown only 6 varieties. Too much apparent freedom, too many options can actually be paralyzing and lead to just walking away.
Huh. That's fascinating. But even as we sometimes avoid choices, we also seem to deeply desire freedom, don't we? Which brings us to something called reactance theory.
Yes, a core idea from the sources is that people have this inherent psychological need for freedom of choice. And they react negatively. They experience what's called reactance whenever they feel that freedom is being threatened or taken away.
So what happens when we feel that reactance, that negative feeling?
Well, it often shows up as frustration or maybe even anger, and it has some pretty predictable consequences. It tends to make the forbidden option seem suddenly much more attractive.
The thing you can't have.
The thing you can't have, exactly. It motivates us to try and somehow reclaim that lost freedom, maybe assert our independence, and in some cases, it can even manifest as aggression towards the person or thing restricting the choice.
So it really highlights that, regardless of those deep philosophical debates about whether we have true free will or not,
Right.
the perception of having control, of having options, is incredibly important to us psychologically, and it really influences how we behave.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
That subjective feeling of freedom matters a great deal.
Okay, let's explore that idea of freedom a bit more, because the sources discuss it in a couple of important ways. First, there's the idea of the freedom to change ourselves.
This ties into our fundamental beliefs about our own traits and abilities. The sources draw a contrast between two main perspectives. On one hand, you have people who hold an entity theory.
Meaning they see traits as fixed entities.
Pretty much. They believe their traits are fixed. You're either smart or you're not. You're talented or you're not. And putting in effort isn't really going to change that fundamental reality.
And how does that affect their choices?
Well, it often leads them to choose easier tasks where they know they can succeed, to avoid the risk of failure, which would feel like a judgment on their fixed ability, And when failure inevitably does happen, it can be absolutely devastating, sometimes leading to learned helplessness, just giving up.
The sources use that comparison between the typical mindset in American baseball, often focused on innate talent,
Right, the naturals.
versus Japanese baseball, which tends to emphasize continuous improvement through relentless hard work and practice.
Exactly. That highlights the cultural difference. The alternative perspective is the incremental theory. This is the belief that your abilities and traits aren't fixed, but can be developed incrementally, step by step, through effort, learning, and practice.
And people with this mindset.
They tend to embrace challenges, seeing them as opportunities to learn and grow. They view criticism not as a judgment, but as useful feedback. And when they encounter failure, their response is often to try harder, figure out what went wrong, and learn from the experience. Studies show this incremental mindset really helps students, for example, adapt and thrive when they move into more demanding academic environments.
So our core belief about whether we can change profoundly impacts the choices we make about what we even attempt and how we react when things get tough, okay? Then there's the feeling of actual freedom of action.
Yeah, the sources touch on that big philosophical question of true free will, which is, incredibly complex and debated for centuries.
Right.
But putting that aside, they emphasize that psychologically, we perceive some of our choices as feeling freer than others. Those are the ones we feel stem more from our own internal desires and intentions and feel less constrained by external pressures or forces.
And does that feeling of freedom matter?
Fascinatingly, yes. The belief in free will itself seems to have measurable consequences for our behavior.
Really? Like what?
Well, there are studies where researchers temporarily lead people to doubt or reject the idea of free will, maybe by having them read essays arguing against it. And what they find is that those people subsequently become more likely to cheat on tasks, they're more likely to steal, they tend to be less helpful towards others, and even show increased aggression.
Wow. So just believing we have free will makes us behave better.
It seems to support and facilitate pro-social behavior, yeah. It's like the belief underpins our sense of personal responsibility, which is pretty crucial for living together effectively in a complex society. It's not just some abstract philosophical idea, it has real-world behavioral consequences.
That connection is pretty profound.
It really is.
Yeah.
And related to this is self-determination theory. This theory highlights our innate psychological need for autonomy, for feeling like our actions are our own.
So actions that feel like they come from within us.
Exactly. Actions that feel like they stem from our own inner drives, interests, and values, rather than feeling forced upon us by external pressure or rewards or obligations. Those actions lead to much better outcomes. Things like greater satisfaction, improved performance, persistence, creativity, and just overall well-being.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about teachers. Teachers who support their students' autonomy, maybe by offering choices and assignments, explaining the relevance of tasks, acknowledging the students' perspectives, they tend to foster much greater intrinsic motivation, interest, and deeper learning compared to teachers who are more controlling.
That makes sense. And there's one more surprising finding that really highlights the power of just perceived control, even if it's not entirely real. The panic button effect.
Ah, yes. This is a great one. The idea is that simply believing you have an escape route or some option for control over an unpleasant situation can drastically reduce the stress you experience, even if you never actually use that option.
How do they show that?
In the classic study, people were exposed to unpleasant, loud noise. One group just had to endure it. Another group had a button they were told could turn off the noise, but they were encouraged not to use it unless necessary. Here's the kicker. The button wasn't actually connected to anything.
It didn't work.
Didn't work at all. But the people who believed they had the option, who had the panic button, reported the noise as much less stressful, showed fewer physiological stress responses, and performed better on tasks afterwards compared to the group with no button. Just the perception of control made all the difference.
So that feeling of having an out, even a placebo out, is deeply beneficial.
It seems to be, yeah. It underlines how important that sense of agency is for our coping and well-being.
Okay, so we've got this capacity for choice. It's shaped by meaning, skewed by biases, influenced by our desire for freedom and our beliefs about ourselves. How do we actually take all that and direct our behavior towards things we want to achieve? This seems to be where goals, plans, and intentions really come into play.
Absolutely. Goals are fundamental tools for us. They're essentially ideas about desired future states, and they act as the critical link between our abstract values and concrete actions. What's really remarkable about humans, compared to most other animals, is our ability to set and pursue extremely complex goals that are very far off in the future. We're talking weeks, months, years, even decades away.
Most animals are focused on the here and now.
Pretty much immediate needs. We, on the other hand, can organize vast stretches of our lives around these distant aspirations.
And the sources distinguish between two key mindsets involved in this whole goal process, right? First, there's the goal-setting mindset.
Mhm. That's the initial phase. When you're considering potential goals, you tend to be more open-minded, hopefully realistic. You're evaluating options based on their feasibility, can I actually do this? And their desirability, do I actually want to do this? You're weighing things up.
Okay, so you're being deliberative. Then, once a goal is actually set, you shift into the goal pursuit mindset.
Right, or you could call it the striving mindset. Here, your thinking changes quite dramatically. You tend to become more optimistic, more focused, almost closed-minded to alternatives or second thoughts about the goal itself.
You're committed.
You're committed. Your focus shifts entirely from whether to pursue the goal to how to pursue it. You become intensely focused on the means, the steps needed to achieve it, and on identifying and overcoming potential obstacles. Realism kind of gives way to determined optimism.
And goals also seem to keep our minds buzzing, don't they? That Zeigarnik effect.
Ah, yes. Bloom-Zeigarnik's discovery. Unfinished tasks or unmet goals tend to stick with us. They intrude on our thoughts. It's like the automatic part of our mind keeps nagging, the deliberate conscious part, saying, hey, remember this thing, it's not done yet.
Yeah, that feeling is familiar.
And the fascinating finding is that simply making a concrete plan for how and when you will complete that unfinished goal can often make the nagging stop. It's as if the automatic system is satisfied once the deliberate system has acknowledged the task and mapped out a clear route forward.
Just having the plan quiets the mental noise. Interesting. Okay, so what makes for an effective goal? The sources had some pointers there.
They did. Generally, effective goals are specific, clearly defined, and challenging. They should stretch you a bit, but still feel reachable or attainable. Vague goals like do better are much less effective than something concrete like increase sales by 10% this quarter.
And they also talked about having a hierarchy of goals.
Yes, this seems really important for long-term pursuits. Having both distal goals, those big long-term aspirations.
Like getting a degree or saving for retirement.
Exactly. And proximal goals, the more immediate short-term steps or sub-goals that lead towards the distal ones. That combination seems most effective. If you only have the huge distant goal, you might feel overwhelmed and not know where to even start. If you only have tiny immediate goals, you might lack an overall sense of direction or purpose.
So the short-term goals provide the stepping stones and feedback, while the long-term goal provides the ultimate destination.
Precisely. And the deliberate system, our conscious planning mind, is particularly useful here. If a specific proximal goal gets blocked for some reason, the deliberate system can step back, look at the bigger picture, the higher level goal, and figure out an alternative strategy or a different path forward.
We're also usually juggling lots of goals at once, aren't we? Work goals, family goals, health goals. How does the mind manage that? The sources mentioned goal shielding.
It's quite clever, really. When you're actively working on one particular goal, your mind seems to automatically inhibit or suppress thoughts related to other competing goals, especially if you're highly committed to the goal you're currently focused on.
So it helps you stay on task.
Exactly. It reduces interference and helps maintain focus. The sources even mention how just thinking about certain people in your life can automatically activate the goals that are typically associated with them. Thinking of a supportive friend might activate relationship goals, while thinking of a demanding boss might activate work-related goals.
The material even suggested that successful people might, maybe unconsciously, choose who they spend time with, based partly on which goals those relationships help activate and support.
It might sound a bit calculated when you put it that way, but strategically building a social environment that aligns with and supports your most important goals is actually a pretty practical strategy for success.
Okay, so we set goals, our mind helps shield them. Then we need a roadmap, planning. How crucial is planning?
Planning seems incredibly beneficial. It forces you to focus your attention on the specific steps needed. It provides clear guidelines for action. That famous study you mentioned earlier about students writing a report over the Christmas holiday.
Right, the planning one.
It showed that the students who made a specific concrete plan, stating exactly when and where they intended to write, were far, far more likely to actually get the report done compared to those who just had a general intention to write it sometime over the break.
Specificity matters, but plans aren't foolproof, are they? The sources mention pitfalls, too.
Definitely. Plans can sometimes be too rigid. If something unexpected happens, a rigid plan can fall apart completely. More flexible plans, maybe setting monthly goals instead of strict daily ones, can sometimes be more resilient to life's inevitable curveballs.
And probably the biggest mistake we consistently make when planning.
Ah, yes. We are, as a rule, wildly optimistic, especially about how long things will take us personally to complete.
The infamous planning fallacy.
That's the one. We tend to believe our own projects, writing a thesis, renovating the kitchen, completing a work assignment will run smoothly and on schedule, even though we have plenty of experience, both personal and observed, showing that most similar projects tend to run late and go over budget.
The Sydney Opera House being the classic extreme example. Years late, massively over budget.
Exactly. And that study where students were asked to predict how long their honors thesis would take, even their pessimistic estimate, the absolute longest they thought it could possibly take, was still significantly shorter than how long it actually took them on average.
We just have this blind spot for our own future difficulties. Why? The sources linked it partly to our generally positive illusions about ourselves, right?
That seems to be a big part of it. We tend to focus on the best-case scenario for ourselves, underestimating potential obstacles. Interestingly, we're often much more accurate when predicting how long a similar project will take someone else. We seem to be more realistic when thinking about others' potential pitfalls.
That's funny.
It is, isn't it? And this also ties back, in a way, to temporal discounting. Our criteria for making decisions can shift depending on how far away the event is. We might choose which concert to attend based purely on how desirable the band is if the show is a year away.
Focusing on the fun part.
Right. But if the concert is next week, suddenly practical considerations like ticket price, travel time, who's going with you, those become much more dominant in the decision. The practical hassles of the near future loom larger than the abstract desirability of the distant future.
Okay, that makes sense. Which brings us then to the actual engine that makes all this goal pursuit and choice management possible: self-regulation and habits.
Right. Self-regulation, you can also call it self-control or willpower. This is our fundamental capacity to consciously, intentionally alter our own responses. That includes our thoughts, our emotions, our impulses, our behavior.
And it's crucial for, well, pretty much everything in modern life.
It really is. It's absolutely fundamental to living effectively in a complex human culture. It's what allows us the flexibility to adapt to different situations, to follow social rules, to maintain a social confidence, keep promises, delay gratification, override immediate impulses for the sake of longer-term goals or social harmony.
And conversely, when self-regulation fails, that's linked to a huge range of problems, isn't it?
Oh, enormous problems, both personal and societal. Things like addiction, debt, obesity, academic failure, crime, impulsive aggression. So many issues have roots in poor self-regulation. The sources even note that people who tend to rely more on gut feelings without exerting self-control often end up with worse long-term outcomes, things like lower income or gambling problems, stuff like that.
So how does effective self-regulation actually work? The sources broke it down into 3 key components, I think.
That's right. 3 essential ingredients. First, you need standards. These are the ideas of how things should be. They're often supplied by our culture rules, laws, moral principles, personal goals, expectations from others. Think of them often as stop rules. They tell us what not to do, or specify a desired state to aim for.
So you need a clear target or limit.
Exactly. And having clear, specific, and non-conflicting standards is key. Vague or contradictory standards make self-regulation much harder.
Okay, standards first. What's second?
Second is monitoring. This is the process of keeping track of your current state or behavior and comparing it against those standards. The sources use the TOTE loop model: test, operate, test, exit.
Like a thermostat.
Precisely like a thermostat. It constantly tests the current temperature of your behavior, compares it to the desired setting, the standard, and if there's a discrepancy, it operates, turns on the furnace or AC to bring things back in line. Then it tests again and exits the loop once the standard is met.
And this monitoring is crucial for things like dieting, right?
Absolutely critical. Studies show that dieters who consistently monitor their food intake and weight are much more successful. When monitoring breaks down, maybe they stop tracking after a slip-up. That's often when binges happen. You can't regulate something if you're not paying attention to it.
But monitoring isn't always easy, is it? It can be disrupted.
Easily. Distractions are a major culprit. Trying to watch your eating while you're also watching TV or at a noisy party. Your capacity to monitor accurately goes way down. And of course, alcohol intoxication is a huge factor here. It significantly impairs our ability to monitor our behavior against our standards.
Right. Okay, so standards, monitoring. What's the third piece?
The third component is the strength or willpower bit. This is the actual capacity for change itself. It's the energy you expend in that operant phase of the TOTE loop, the mental effort required to override the impulse, resist the temptation, or force yourself to do the difficult thing to bring your behavior back in line with the standard.
And this willpower. It's
Yeah,
limited.
it seems to be. The classic study with the radishes and cookies demonstrated this really well. People who had to resist the temptation of freshly baked cookies and eat radishes instead subsequently showed less persistence on a difficult puzzle task compared to those who hadn't had to exert prior self-control. Resisting the cookies seemed to deplete some kind of limited resource.
So willpower gets used up.
It appears to function somewhat like a muscle in that sense. It gets tired with exertion. This leads to phenomena like decision fatigue.
Making lots of choices wears you out.
It seems to. Making a series of decisions, especially complex or difficult ones, appears to deplete that same willpower resource, which then impairs the quality of subsequent decisions or reduces your ability to exert self-control in other areas.
How does that show up?
People might start avoiding making further decisions altogether, or they might rely on simpler, easier decision rules, like just going with the default option when buying a car instead of carefully considering all the features, because their decision-making capacity is fatigued.
And that really disturbing parole judge study really drove this home, didn't it?
That was a powerful, if unsettling, real-world example. It showed that judges were significantly more likely to grant parole early in the morning or right after a food break, compared to later in the day before a break.
Suggesting their willpower was depleted as the day wore on.
Exactly. Making repeated, demanding decisions seemed to drain their mental resources, leading them to default to the easier, safer option, which in that context was denying parole. Crucially, the favorable decision rate reset jumped back up right after their breaks, presumably when their mental energy or willpower was somewhat restored.
Wow, that shows how this internal state can have massive real-world consequences.
Absolutely. But, of course, our behavior isn't all driven by this conscious, effortful willpower. A huge chunk of what we do every day is governed by habits.
Right, the automatic stuff.
Exactly. Habits are those acquired behaviors that, through repetition, become almost automatic. They require very little conscious thought or deliberate control. Our mind efficiently transfers these frequently repeated actions over to the automatic system to free up conscious resources.
And they're really common, aren't they?
Incredibly common. Some research suggests that nearly half of our daily actions are performed habitually, often in the same location, triggered by the same cues. They're often the sort of fossilized remains of past goal-directed behaviors that have become ingrained.
So habits actually develop because we pursued a goal repeatedly in the past.
That's generally how they form, yes. Goals promote the learning of habits. And here's a key point. Habits can actually sustain goal-directed behavior, especially when our willpower is low.
How so?
Think about something demanding, like studying during exam week. When you're stressed, tired, and your willpower is probably depleted from resisting distractions, you're much more likely to fall back on your established habits. If you have a good habit of studying at a certain time and place, that habit might carry you through even when conscious motivation flags.
But the flip side is also true, right? If you have bad habits.
Exactly. If your habit under stress is to grab comfort food or procrastinate online, those are the behaviors you'll likely default to when willpower is low. Good habits can be powerful allies, conserving that precious mental energy. Imagine how utterly exhausting life would be if every single action, from brushing your teeth to driving to work, required conscious deliberation and willpower.
We'd be drained by breakfast.
Totally. Habits are efficient. But they can also conflict with our conscious goals, like a habit of eating sweets conflicting with a health goal. Breaking bad habits or overriding a habit that conflicts with a current goal requires that effortful self-control, that willpower. And as we've said, when willpower is depleted, we're much more likely to slip back into those unwanted habits.
So habits are efficient, but managing them, especially changing the bad ones, really relies on having enough of that finite willpower resource available.
That seems to be the crux of it, yes.
Okay, which leads us, maybe inevitably, to perhaps the most challenging part of this whole deep dive. Looking at the flip side of all this amazing capacity for control and choice. Looking at irrationality and self-destruction.
Self-defeating behavior. It's defined as any action where people bring failure, suffering, or misfortune upon themselves. On the surface, it seems completely paradoxical, doesn't it? especially if you think of humans as primarily rational agents trying to maximize good outcomes. Why would anyone deliberately act in a way that harms them?
The sources were quick to point out, though, that people don't typically seek failure or suffering directly. Those older ideas, like Freud's death drive or the notion of a fear of success, those are largely discredited now.
Right. The evidence just doesn't really support the idea that people have an intrinsic desire to fail. Instead, the sources identify two main pathways that lead to this kind of seemingly stupid or self-defeating behavior. The first involves trade-offs.
Meaning people accept a bad outcome because it's linked to a good outcome they want?
Exactly. Especially when there's a conflict between immediate gratification and delayed costs. People accept the negative long-term consequences because they're getting a highly desirable short-term reward.
This sounds like temporal discounting again, and it ties right into the capacity to delay gratification, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That ability to sacrifice a smaller immediate reward for a larger future one, famously measured in children by the marshmallow test, is a really powerful predictor of better outcomes later in life. Academic success, better health, financial stability, you name it.
But the sources also added a nuance there, didn't they? That sometimes taking the immediate reward might not be irrational.
That's an important point. In environments that are highly unstable or unpredictable, where the future is very uncertain, grabbing the sure thing right now might actually be the most adaptive strategy. If you don't know if the future reward will ever materialize, maybe taking the marshmallow now makes sense.
Okay, so trade-offs, especially immediate versus delayed outcomes, is one path. What's the second reason for self-defeating behavior?
The second main reason is relying on faulty knowledge or using ineffective strategies. Basically, people operate based on beliefs about themselves or the world, or employ strategies to reach their goals that are just plain wrong or don't actually work the way they think they do.
Like the procrastinator example.
That's a classic one. Many chronic procrastinators hold the belief that they work best under pressure. But research consistently shows this isn't true. They might only work under pressure, but the quality of their work is usually worse, and they experience much more stress. Yet they cling to this faulty belief, which perpetuates the self-defeating cycle of procrastination.
So bad choices stemming from bad information or flawed theories about how things work. Okay. And then the sources address the most extreme form of self-defeating behavior, suicide, which is described as uniquely human.
Yes, it's often framed, tragically, as the ultimate self-defeating trade-off, exchanging all potential future experiences, good and bad, for the immediate cessation of acute, unbearable present suffering, whether that's overwhelming emotional pain, psychological distress, or profound feelings of worthlessness or hopelessness.
A willingness to trade everything away just for relief now.
That seems to be a common thread. It often arises, the sources suggest, from a severe and painful discrepancy between a person's high expectations or standards for themselves or their life and their perceived reality, often triggered by a significant negative life change, a major loss, or falling drastically short of some important benchmark.
And ironically, the sources noted it can sometimes be more prevalent in circumstances that seem objectively favorable.
Yes, that's a grim paradox. Sometimes being surrounded by apparent success or happiness in others can make one's own deep misery feel even more isolating and unbearable by contrast.
And that high self-awareness we talked about earlier, which is usually a strength, can it become part of the problem here?
It can become acutely painful, yes. Some theories propose that suicide attempts can be desperate efforts to escape from or shut down an overwhelmingly negative and painful state of self-awareness. The focus narrows dramatically. Suicidal individuals are often described as being emotionally numb, intensely focused on the concrete details of the present moment, with very little capacity to reflect on the broader future implications.
Which might explain why suicide notes are often quite mundane, not philosophical treatises.
Exactly. They often deal with practical matters, instructions, apologies, reflecting that narrowed, present-focused, and perhaps cognitively constricted state.
And the sources also mention feelings of burdensomeness.
Yes, tragically, the feeling that one's continued existence is a heavy burden on loved ones or society can contribute. In this distorted state of mind, ending one's life might be perceived, however wrongly, as an act of relieving others of that burden.
And then you have phenomena like suicide bombers,
which represent extreme cases where culturally constructed meanings, ideologies, or group identities completely override the most fundamental biological drive for self-preservation.
It's incredibly complex.
It is, and while no single theory can explain every instance of suicide, the pattern of seeking escape from unbearable current misery often involving that trade-off between the present and the future, appears frequently in the research. It's a chilling manifestation of the human capacity for choice and self-direction, taken to its most destructive possible end.
So, okay, zooming back out after all that. What does this entire exploration from meaning and choice through goals and willpower to habits and even self-destruction tell us about what makes us human?
Well, compared to most other animals, it's clear we have this incredibly complex, elaborate inner system dedicated to guiding and controlling our behavior. It's deeply interwoven with our use of meaning and symbols provided by culture.
We're not just reacting to the environment.
Not at all. We can link the present moment to very distant future goals, reflect on the past to inform current choices. Our decision-making isn't just based on immediate needs or stimuli. It involves this sophisticated, deliberate system that can weigh abstract factors, anticipate long-term consequences, simulate possibilities, and consciously override immediate impulses.
And that advanced self-regulation capacity, it's what enables so much of human life, isn't it?
It really is. It allows us to adapt flexibly to incredibly complex cultural rules and social structures. Yeah. It lets us take on diverse roles, keep promises, cooperate on a massive scale. It underpins things like morality, law, economic systems. It enables long-term planning, allows us to create complex technologies, art, science, things that require overriding countless immediate impulses in service of larger, often abstract goals. We can choose a diet, save money for retirement, decades away, follow intricate laws.
We have this incredible flexibility.
Incredible flexibility and capacity for deliberate control. But as the sources make painfully clear, this very same sophisticated capacity also comes with a potential dark side.
Yeah.
Our susceptibility to cognitive biases, our irrationality, our capacity for profound self-deception and ultimately self-destruction, including the unique and tragic phenomenon of suicide. These also seem to operate on a scale that's unmatched in the rest of the animal kingdom. It's like the flip side of our advanced cognitive abilities.
So ultimately, this remarkable human toolkit for meaningful thought, for reasoning, for planning, for self-regulation, it gives us a profound degree of freedom. It gives us the ability to make choices that can lead to incredible flourishing, both individually and collectively. Even if, as we've spent this whole time exploring, navigating all those options and managing our complex inner world is often really challenging, sometimes stressful, and sometimes, unfortunately, leads us down some very difficult or destructive paths.
Absolutely. The journey through these sources really throws that fundamental tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? The tension between our immense capacity for conscious control and all the powerful forces both inside us and outside us that constantly influence and sometimes undermine the choices we make.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've navigated the really complex landscape of human choice and control, from those small, subtle decisions of daily life, right up to the most profound and sometimes, yes, self-destructive paths we can take. We've seen how meaning fundamentally shapes our actions, how those subtle biases constantly nudge our choices, the real power that comes from setting and pursuing goals, and the, frankly, surprising mechanics behind self-regulation and habits.
And we've also had to touch on that darker side, exploring why we sometimes act in ways that seem directly against our own best interests.
Right. So here's where it gets really interesting, thinking about how you might apply this. Consider that planning fallacy we talked about.
Our tendency to be way too optimistic about our own timelines and plans.
Exactly. Even when we know intellectually that similar projects undertaken by others often run into delays and problems. Now, combine that knowledge with what we learned about the critical importance of monitoring for self-regulation.
Like rigorously tracking progress, whether it's calories or project milestones.
And also understanding that willpower is this real, depletable resource, but also something that can potentially be strengthened, like a muscle, through regular exercise. So the question for you to think about is this. How can you specifically use those insights, the need for honest monitoring and the nature of willpower, to look at your own long-term goals and plans, especially the ones you might currently be feeling overly optimistic about, and make them significantly more realistic, more robust, and ultimately more achievable?
That's definitely something to consider as you go about making your own choices, big and small today and, well, into the future.